Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of the Legal Business Talk Show. I remain your host, Ifoma Ben. I'm a corporate and commercial lawyer, and I help startups and entrepreneurs build legally protected businesses. Tonight, we'll be discussing intellectual property monetization strategies. How can a startup monetize its intellectual property? How can companies make money from their intellectual property? That will be the focus of our discussion tonight. And I'll take a few seconds to see who is online and invite them. Invite a few persons. Let me see. Let me invite a few persons online quickly before we go on to tonight's topic, monetizing intellectual property. Okay, I think we'll just continue with the broadcast then later. Okay, what actually is intellectual property? When you talk about intellectual property, what do you mean? What we need to just give a little background about intellectual property and what it really means. Intellectual property are intangible assets. They are assets, they are property that cannot be felt. You can't hold it. You can't really say it like the way you have land. You have maybe you have a particular plot of land. That those ones are physical assets that you can see, you can feel and touch. But intellectual properties are creation of your mind, and examples are maybe when you come up with a book, you have ideas and you put them down into writing. That book becomes part of your intellectual property, even from the name intellectual. That's from your intellect, what you come up with. So they are intangible assets, and the development of intellectual property is very crucial to innovation and the sustained growth of an entity, of an organization, of a company. And these assets can be leveraged as another source of revenue. It helps to strengthen the overall profits of the company, and it helps to diversify risk in the company. So intangible assets are developed as part of a company's overall productivity and growth. It contributes to the main economic benefit of the company, and is like an additional source of revenue that can be generated for the company. And there are various types of intellectual property, and there are also various ways we can monetize intellectual property. So intellectual property or intangible assets includes let me just give some examples. Trademark. You have things like brand logos, words, slogans, even jingles. They are part of your trademarks. Then you have patents. Patents have to do with inventions. You also have copyright, which has to do with books, maybe written works. Photography also falls under copyright. Music also falls under copyright. So these are creations of the mind. Industrial designs of products, even your domain names, your trade secrets, a method of doing something that's only known to a particular set of individuals, the goodwill associated with the brand. So these are all your intellectual property. And our focus tonight is to look at how you can turn this intellectual property, how you can use them as money making machine. There are various ways you can monetize them and use them to grow the source of revenue, use them to grow the revenue of the company, to bring additional income to the company. So unlike tangible assets, maybe examples like houses, cars, intangible assets, intellectual property does not diminish through use. So various persons can use intellectual property at the same time. So I can license my intellectual property to, let's say, 10 persons, 100 persons, as the case may be, and they will be using it simultaneously and be paying royalty to me or to my company. So it's not like maybe when I'm driving my car, I will be the one using it at that particular time. No one else can use it. So it's different. Intellectual property can be used by different people at different times or at the same time. So that is one of the peculiarities of intellectual property and one of the advantages of intellectual property. It doesn't diminish through use and can be used by several persons at the same time. So now going to the various ways by which intellectual property can be monetized, we'll be looking at some key points, some key monetization strategies like co-development, licensing, collateralization, securitization, sale, leaseback, and spin-off. So I'll be discussing these 6 points, 6 ways by which we can monetize our intellectual property. I'll be discussing this shortly. Starting with co-development. What does co-development really mean? Is like one of the traditional ways of monetizing intellectual property. It simply means companies coming together. They can invest their time and resources in creating intellectual property. Then it can be a number of companies coming together to invest their time and resources to create this intellectual property assets, these intangible assets, and they can have a co-development partnership. What this does is that it helps them to diversify risk. They distribute risk. If one person or one company is creating these intangible assets, the company will bear the risk, will bear the cost, the time, all the resources that will be put into this intellectual property. But where there is a co-development partnership, it helps to distribute the risk, and it makes it increases the resources available, because about 4 or 5 companies can bring the resources together and develop this intellectual property. So it helps to diversify the risk. So the scope of the co-development partnership can be discussed and agreed upon by the parties in that particular agreement. So they can also, where they put the resources together and jointly develop this intellectual property, they will also reap the fruits collectively. So what it does is it diversifies the risk, it creates more, makes more resources available, and it brings in more talent to generate and to create this intellectual property. And it also has a wider market where they can also generate income from this a partnership. So there are certain incentives in the co-development agreement, such as there is increased royalty rates or milestone payments, and that can enhance the effectiveness of that particular arrangement, that particular agreement. So these are this part of the traditional methods of monetizing intellectual property. So co-development agreements may be an excellent tool to distribute risk while combining resources to achieve a common goal among multiple parties. So another point we are going to discuss is licensing. That is very key in monetizing intellectual property. Licensing simply means giving another person the right to use your intellectual property for a fee, and that fee is the royalty that is being paid by the licensee. So due to the increasing global nature of businesses, licensing of intellectual property assets is really becoming very lucrative and is a very effective method of establishing and retaining market advantage. And in licensing, you can license, let's use a trademark for instance. You have a trademark, let's say in the food industry, let's say Mr. Biggs, Domino Pizza, and some other quick service restaurant. Most of the quick service restaurant we see around the city are not really. You can see a lot of TFC, KFC. Some of them are using the franchise of KFC to carry on that business, and they are paying royalty to the franchise. So that's the person who is the company that granted them the license to carry on that particular business. So in this, I'll just give a quick a little background on franchise. A franchise is an agreement, is a license between two parties, and one party or a group of people, the franchisee, the person who we are giving the rights to market your product or your service using your trademark. Trademark now, like I explained, is one of the intellectual property rights, one of the intellectual property assets. It could be using your trademark, your trade name, or any other of your business to market their product or their service. So assuming you have Domino Pizzas, you have a franchise, a license from Domino Pizza. In that case, you can have a franchise agreement with them where you can, there are certain terms that will be stated in that franchise agreement, and in that case, you follow a particular method of creating a particular product or service, and you sell that product or service in the name of the franchisor, in the name of that company that granted you that license. Usually the franchisors usually have already created a brand, a well-known brand, and you as a startup may not really have that name. So for you to really grow in that business, it might be necessary for you to look for those established names in that particular industry and get their franchise, get the license to trade using their name, their trademark or their trade name to market your product or your service. In that case now, that company that you're using their name or they are using their trademark is making money by granting you that license. You pay royalty to the franchisor, to the company granting you the license. So they make money by granting, they can grant various licenses. They can grant up to 10 or 100 depending on certain factors. So, and each of the franchisees, each of the persons who are granted this license will pay a royalty, will pay a fee called royalty to the person or the company granting them the franchise, and that company is making money. So that's part of the way in connecting it to the IP monetization strategies. That's part of the way the franchisor makes money from his trade name and his trademark. So you are making money by using the trade name of that company to market your goods and your services. The company that also granted you license is also making money by from the royalty you are paying to the company. So it's like a win-win situation. So that company is monetizing the franchise. So here now is monetizing its intellectual property. So licensing is one of the major ways of monetizing intellectual property, and it has proved very, very effective in intellectual property monetization. Then in licensing, there are also certain factors that have to be considered. The scope of the ownership of the licensed products, the exclusivity, and some other factors, the transfer of sublicensing rights. So these are the areas where the intellectual property lawyer will come in to draft certain clauses, the agreement that will cover the relationship between parties, and see that there is no loophole. You don't end up in court. So that's very, very important. So these considerations are very, very important, like the job of the IP lawyer here, because it is very important to make sure that you avoid very costly litigation in court. So another aspect, having discussed co-development licensing, we are now going to discuss securitization. That's using intellectual property as a security. So intangible assets can be used to generate finance. So you can have a copyright, trademark, and patent securitization agreement. Maybe with investors, you can use it to as a security to raise funds from investors. So the securitization agreements have garnered a lot of attention from investors because it's because of its relatively stable risk and return characteristics, and is associated with a particular intellectual property assets. So, and in all these areas, you need the counsel of an expert who would put you through in this relationship. Then collateralization is actually from the word collateral. When you talk about collateralization, you talk about let's say you want to raise money from the bank, or you can use that as a collateral. So even for startup companies, IP assets can be collateralized, can be used as a collateral to raise capital, either through investment, through joint ventures, co-development arrangements, like I said earlier, or through other maybe the commercial banks. And how can you use this to raise funds? For you to use intellectual property to raise funds, it has to there are some valuation that has to be done. You need to know the value of that intellectual property, and know, let's say you want to get 5 million from the bank and you want to use your intellectual property as a collateral for that the funds for the finance. Then there has to be some form of valuation, and there are some basic valuation methods for intellectual property. There are various approaches. It could be income approach, it could be market approach, it could also be cost approach. So when you are talking about this valuation, there are IP experts who value intellectual property and know how you can use them to raise funds from investors or from the banks. So there are these valuation methods. Let's say if you bought a house, for instance, the financing appraisal could be prepared, and it can also contain some of these approaches. The income approach basically asks, in respect of that house that you bought, how much rent would this property generate? So applying it to your intellectual property, you also know the value how much will this intellectual property generate? So just like the way I'm using a property now, the landed property or a house as an example, because that's a tangible asset that we can see, you can feel. So you talk about how much rent will this property generate. You also talk about if you are using the market approach, for instance, you compare similar properties in that location. Let's say property in Ikoyi, a 3-bedroom flat or a bungalow. What using the market approach, what will be the you will be comparing similar property, similar assets in that location in that location to know what value you can attach to it. So if you are saying property 3-bedroom flat in Ikoyi, how much will you sell it? What will be the value? So you use that to use that as a valuation method for that. Then if you're also using the cost approach, still using the real estate, the house, physical house example that we are giving, if you are using the cost approach, you also talk about how will you replicate this asset from the scratch. So how much will it cost to build this house or to re-engineer this technology? So these are approaches that intellectual property experts use to know the value of intellectual property that can be used as a collateral for raising funds. So if you seek to collateralize your intellectual property assets, you need an appraisal. So that's where IP valuation experts will come in, because they are readily available to do the valuation in respect of your intellectual property. Just like the way the real estate, the real property appraisals do, there are also IP valuation experts who would use all these approaches in providing an intellectual property appraisal that could be used by the banks, investors, and others. Really in our location in Nigeria, this is not so common, but in the international community, this is widely used by a lot of companies and commercial organizations to raise funds for companies where the intellectual property is valued, and that can be used for them by them to raise funds from investors and also even the traditional banks. So managing intellectual property could be complex, and it can also involve a lot of legal issues. So startup companies are really advised to get a skilled intellectual property lawyer who is experienced in handling many of these issues related to intellectual property monetization. There are a lot of international organizations that have really monetized their intellectual property. When you talk about IBM now, the International Business Machines Corporation, being an American multinational information technology company, raises like statistics. The research shows that they raise like 1 billion or thereabouts in licensing and monetizing their intellectual property. That's a lot of money, and not naira, not 1 billion, a billion naira, dollars. So the intellectual property assets is really a way of raising funds for the company if we really understand it very well and we utilize it. So we don't even, when you understand the advantages of this and you go ahead to seek expert guidance on how to achieve this, then it can be brought to limelight and it can be properly utilized in the IBM generates over $1 billion in annual licensing revenues from its intellectual property assets. That's a whole lot of money. So even that licensing that I talked about, I just use franchise as an example, because maybe using the quick service restaurants, the ones we know that is very common in our society, it can help to drive the message home. So you imagine a company granting license, maybe all these quick service restaurants granting license to a lot of people, and they are paying royalty to them. In a year, they will generate a lot of money just by allowing other people to use their names and their logos to market their products and services. It doesn't affect, they will still be running their own businesses. It doesn't affect them in any way. They'll still be running their own businesses and still be making money by allowing other people replicate the process and use their name and their trade name to carry out, to market their products and services. Just cool money apart from the ones they are making in their major source of income. So these are areas that startups need to really look at, and that's another way of bringing additional source of income to the company. So we have discussed about four ways of monetizing intellectual property. I'll now go to the fifth one, sale lease back. By sale lease back, I mean sale lease back of intangible assets, of intellectual property, is really a useful financial arrangement, and intellectual property can be combined. It can be combined and resold as a pool. Let's say you have a number of intellectual property, you put them together, you combine them and sell them as a pool. Then under this arrangement, a share of the proceeds may be returned to each contributor, and this is also a way of diversifying risk. Let's say about 5 companies have intellectual property that are related. They can come together, put those assets together and sell to a third party, and by selling that, they make money from that sale, and each of the companies involved will be rewarded, they will share the proceeds of that sale. So that's basically what a sale leaseback of intangible assets means. So it's also another way of monetizing intellectual property. Then we go to the sixth point, spin out. Spin out is actually an opportunity. There are spin out opportunities relating to intellectual property rights. It really means consists of moving a portion of intellectual property assets from an existing company to a new company. So this existing company has this intellectual property. A portion of it can be moved to a new company, and by doing so, what you're actually doing is it could be exploited more effectively under the umbrella of a new operation, and this presents fewer competing priorities. And forming new companies may also attract new investments and new talent. So this is also one of the ways of monetizing intellectual property. So there are certain things when you talk about intellectual property monetization. You have to also do due diligence. This is where the legal experts come in, the intellectual property experts also come in to see how these transactions can be done effectively without any legal issue. So an essential element prior to the negotiation and drafting of a commercial agreement or transaction regarding intangible rights is actually what we call due diligence. Due diligence basically you look at, you try to see that proper things are done. You can even conduct some background checks to see that maybe your client or the person who engaged you is taking the right step. So that due diligence is very important. So the due diligence provide a detailed insight into the current and future strengths, the weaknesses and opportunities when it comes to the exploitation of intellectual property assets. And when it comes intellectual property assets, it's something that you really need to look at the strengths and weaknesses. As we're talking about the advantages, there are also some disadvantages. There could be weaknesses, there could be opportunities, there are strengths in that kind of transaction. So there has to be proper due diligence before you delve into it. You in analyzing, appraising intellectual property before you get a license or pay royalty. There has to be a due diligence to critically analyze that particular transaction you're about to enter, to know its strengths and weaknesses and know whether it favors you. So due diligence provides the business, the investors, the purchasers the opportunity to access and manage the risk, and to formulate a very an overarching strategy. Is very, very key. In fact, due diligence, as it is important in intellectual property monetization, it is also important in other kinds of transactions. It's very important in every transaction you are going into to know where the strengths and weaknesses of that relationship, and know whether it is proper for you to enter into the business relationship. Intellectual property issues may be easily corrected earlier in the lifestyle of a business, but it could also be very expensive. So that's why due diligence is very important in engaging in this kind of transaction. Is very, very important. So you need to engage an expert in that field, an expert in intellectual property, an intellectual property consultant, intellectual property lawyer who can help you to appraise this IP relationship and transactions before you enter into that particular relationship. So I think I would pause here to look into the comments to see, acknowledge those who have joined the broadcast. Gaius Chibeze, thank you for joining. Chukwudi Njoko, thank you for joining. Okomiti Lawson Ife says, I want you to talk about small and medium enterprise. I actually mentioned startups. I actually talked about how startups can leverage, can use franchise to market their products and services. How they can use established names. There are names in maybe in a particular industry. I use the example of quick service restaurants like the likes of KFC, Tasty Fried Chicken, Mr. Biggs, and some Domino Pizza, and some others. So if a startup, an SME, is interested in going into food business, the person can look into that area and see whether its company can get a franchise from these established names and use their trade name to market their goods and services. That's also how the SME can come in. Ibe Agatada, thank you for joining. Henry Iwanyanwu, thank you for joining. Kasmia Chidebere Ihanacho, thank you for joining. Okay, I would quickly wrap up. Some of these discussions. So I'll just summarize the monetization strategies. I'll just summarize. So we have I talked about co-development, talked about licensing, securitization, collateralization. That's using IP as a collateral to raise funds from investors or commercial banks. We also talked about sale leaseback, and talks about SME out. So there are other areas also that I will just touch quickly, because receiving bank loans using IP is what I mean by collateralization, using receiving bank loans using intellectual property as a collateral. Then you also have paying debts using intellectual property instead of money. There are sometimes maybe your company can be owing money to another company, and you may not have the physical cash to pay, but the company has created a wide range of intellectual property. You can pay those debts using intellectual property instead of money. So in terms of investment, intellectual property assets could also be invested in new projects instead of real money. And intellectual property assets could be used for paying authorized capital. In fact, there are various ways we can use money for. We can also use our intellectual property assets. We can also use our intellectual property to pay for all those. So high value of intellectual property assets allows to receive increased reimbursement from unfair competitors. You also know that there are times when some people might want to infringe on your intellectual property. You have the right to protect your intellectual property through the maybe there are several processes you can they can be made to pay damages to you for infringing on your rights, so they can reimburse you from unfair competition. And also you can have a high valuated price of business. Can also it gives you a prestigious status. A high valuated price of business confirms reliability and confidence of business partner. So intellectual property can be used in fact in various ways, and it could generate money, royalty revenue for the brand using the licensing and franchise agreements like I stated earlier. So intellectual property monetization strategies could be used to generate a lot of money for the company. So this is an area that a new company, startups are advised to look into, especially some tech startups. There are intellectual property that are being generated, that are being created. Look for a way to protect this intellectual property, and it could be used, especially as awareness is going on in most developed countries. These are used, and they are utilized. Intellectual property is utilized on a daily basis and is valuable. But a lot of us here, especially in our own environment, in our own country, Nigeria, we are just beginning to know what it means. There are a lot in the creative industry, in the music industry, entertainment industry. There are a lot of intellectual property being created on a daily basis, and some of these creators, some of these persons do not understand the kind of value what their intellectual property is worth. So it is important we create this awareness and realize that we can make a lot of money through our intellectual property by maximizing and by utilizing our intellectual property rights. Conrad Nwaka, thank you for joining. This Mario Chima, thank you for listening. So we'll be wrapping up this broadcast here, and I would call for questions if there are questions, and if there is none, I'll quickly wrap up the discussion here. In the next 2 weeks, we'll be having another broadcast, second Sunday of March. We'll be having another show, another legal business talk show, and we'll be bringing to us another interesting topic. Onyinyechi Okemeziem is just joining. Onyi, how are you doing? Thank you for joining. We are wrapping up now. You might need to listen to the broadcast, to the replay later. So thank you all for being part of the Legal Business Talk Show, the 21st episode of the Legal Business Talk Show. 2 weeks ago, I had a gratitude session. What I mean by that was 2 weeks ago, what made it a year I started this show, and I thank God for his grace for taking me thus far, and I thank you all for being part of this show since last year up to this moment. We hope to get it better and better from time to time. So we'll be wrapping up this show here. Thank you all for joining. I remain Ifoma Ben, your corporate and commercial legal consultant. If you have questions, please state them in the comment section. After this broadcast, I will come back to attend to all questions. Thank you all for joining. See you in 2 weeks. Bye for now.